Chapter 11 of Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 6. This is a Librivox Recording. All Librivox Recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 6, by John Hay and John George Nicolay. Chapter 11, Financial Measures. The wisdom displayed by Mr. Lincoln in choosing his cabinet, not from among his personal adherents, but from among the most eminent representatives of the Republicans of the country, shone out more and more clearly as the war went on, and its enormous exigencies tested the utmost powers of each member of the government. A great orator and statesman has said that, in this respect, Mr. Lincoln showed at the outset that nature had fitted him for a ruler, and accident only had hid his earlier life in obscurity. Mr. Evarts says, "I cannot hesitate to think that the presence of Mr. Seward and Mr. Chase in the great offices of State and Treasury, and their faithful concurrence in the public service and the public repute of the President's conduct of the Government, gave to the people all the benefits which might have justly been expected from the election of either to be himself the head of the Government, and much else besides. I know of no warrant in the qualities of human nature to have hoped that either of these great political leaders would have made as good a minister under the administration of the other as President, as both of them did under the administration of Mr. Lincoln. I see nothing in Mr. Lincoln's great qualities and great authority with this people which could have commensurately served our need in any place in the conduct of affairs except at their head. We do not question that posterity will confirm this sober and impartial judgment of one of the most intelligent of contemporary observers. Lincoln, Chase, and Seward were, by a long interval, the first three Republicans of their time, and each, by what would almost appear a special favor of Providence, was placed in a position where he could be of most unquestioned service to the country. Had either of the three, except Lincoln, been President, the nation must have lost the inestimable services of the other two. We have already dwelt at some length upon the responsibility which devolved during these years upon the Secretary of State, and upon the unfailing courage, sagacity, and industry with which he met it. Before recounting an incident which threatened for a time to deprive the President of the powerful assistance of his two great subordinates, it will be necessary to review, in a manner however brief and inadequate, some of the main points in the administration of the finances during the war. The Republican party came to power at a time when its adversaries had reduced the credit of the country to a point which now appears difficult to believe. Even before the election of Mr. Lincoln, Howell Cobb, the Secretary of the Treasury, found it difficult to obtain the small sums necessary to meet the ordinary expenses of the government, and early in the session of Congress, which began in December, 1860, after the election of Mr. Lincoln, amid the gathering gloom of imminent civil war, Congress authorized the issue of 10 millions of Treasury notes, payable in 1 year, to be issued at the best rate obtainable by the Secretary of the Treasury. That officer having advertised for bids for half the amount authorized, only a small sum was offered, the rates ranging from 10 to 36%. The Secretary accepted the offers at 12, obtaining, even at that exorbitant rate, a meager sum. Afterwards, a syndicate of bankers, upon hard conditions proposed by themselves, took the balance of the 5 millions at 12%. A month later, when Mr. Cobb had retired and John A. Dix had assumed the charge of the Treasury, the slight increase of public confidence derived from the character of the new Secretary enabled him to dispose of the other 5 millions at an average of 10 5/8%. In February, Congress having authorized a further loan of 25 millions at 6%, Mr. Dix was able to obtain 8 millions at a discount of nearly 10%. It was in this depressed and discouraging state of the public finances that Salmon P. Chase took charge of the Treasury. Without any special previous experience, without any other preparation for his exacting task than great natural abilities, unswerving integrity and fidelity, and unwearying industry, he grappled with the difficulties of the situation in a manner which won him the plaudits of the civilized world and will forever enshrine his name in the memory of his fellow citizens. To quote Mr. Evarts again, "The exactions of the place knew no limits. A people wholly unaccustomed to the pressure of taxation, and with an absolute horror of a national debt, was to be rapidly subjected to the first without stint, and to be buried under a mountain of the last. Taxes which should support military operations on the largest scale, and yet not break the back of industry, which alone could pay them, loans in every form that financial skill could devise, and to the farthest verge of the public credit, and finally the extreme resort of governments under the last stress and necessity, the subversion of the legal tender by the substitution of what has been aptly and accurately called the coined credit of the government for its coined money. All these exigencies and all these expedients made up the daily problems of the Secretary's life. Whether the genius of Hamilton, dealing with great difficulties, transcended that of Chase, meeting the largest exigencies with greater resources, is an unprofitable speculation. They stand together, in the judgment of their countrymen, the great financiers of our history. Immediately upon assuming office, Mr. Chase addressed himself to the difficult work before him. The only provisions which had been made by law for the support of the Government were the fragments of the loan, authorized but unsold, of his predecessor. Satisfied that the rates at which money had been borrowed both by Cobb and by Dix were unnecessarily degrading to the national credit, he firmly refused terms similar to those which they had accepted, and succeeded in borrowing $3 million, none of it at a lower rate than 94, and a few days later he borrowed $5 million more at par. Even in May, after the outbreak of the war, he was able to place some $9 million of government loans and notes at a rate only a little below their face value. These were, of course, but temporary makeshifts, based upon previous legislation, but when Congress met on the 4th of July, in that first special session called by President Lincoln, an entirely new system of finance had to be instituted. The national debt on the 1st of July was $90 million, and there was a balance in the Treasury of only $2 million. There was something appalling in the sudden and monstrous increase of the expenses of the Government as a consequence of the war. The appropriations for the fiscal year 1860 to 61 were but $79 million, and the estimates for the year following, notwithstanding the threatening outlook, were only for $75 million. Nobody foresaw the coming exigencies. No provision was made to meet them. Mr. Chase's estimates for the first fiscal year of his administration reached the astounding aggregate of $318,500,000, but before the short session of Congress adjourned, even this enormous sum was found inadequate. To meet these immense demands, he proposed to raise $80 million by taxes and $240 million by loans. By increasing the taxes upon imports, he expected to add $27 million to the $30 million already derived from the tariff, and $3 million from miscellaneous sources made up $60 million, leaving $20 million to be derived from direct taxes and the excise. Congress responded with the greatest decision and patriotism to the proposition of the Secretary. They authorized on the 17th of July a loan of $250 million and passed laws increasing duties on a great number of articles. They apportioned a direct tax of $20 million among the States, which was cheerfully paid by the loyal States, and an unsuccessful attempt was made to enforce it by commissioners for the States in rebellion. The estimates voted for the Army were $207 million, for the Navy $56 million, and only $1,300,000 for civil and miscellaneous purposes. Every day during the summer and autumn the expenses of the war increased. For the last quarter of the year they averaged nearly $50 million a month. One of the first measures of relief adopted by the Secretary under the authority of Congress was the issue of the so-called demand notes, payable in coin, for the payment of salaries or other debts of the United States, and by a later act made receivable for public dues. There was at first a great distrust of this form of paper money, and the Secretary of the Treasury and other public officers, in order to create confidence, joined in an agreement to receive it in payment of their salaries. General Scott issued a circular to the Army announcing the issue of paper money and advising its acceptance. Several corporations declined to accept the notes in payment of freight. There is an instance recorded of a bank in New York refusing to accept a large amount of them except as a special deposit, which deposit was afterwards withdrawn, the value of the notes having increased with the rise of gold, in which they were payable, to 50% premium in other paper money. But this and other like expedients gave only temporary relief. For the permanent and wholesome administration of financial affairs, a great national loan was necessary, and Mr. Chase held in the city of New York on the 19th of August, 1861, a conference with the representatives of the principal bankers of the United States. He laid before them with equal eloquence and judgment not only the needs of the Government, but the safety and value of its securities, and after a long and earnest discussion, during the course of which it seemed at one time possible that his mission would result in failure, he formed a syndicate of banks which advanced the Government $50 million, and after this loan was successfully placed, $50 million more were derived from the same source, the Government paying 7 3/10% for the money. And later he used the authority conferred upon him by the act of July 17, 1861, to issue $50 million more of 6% bonds at a rate making them equivalent to 7%. When Congress met in December and the Secretary in his first annual report gave an account of his stewardship, he reported an aggregate of $197 million realized from loans in all forms. The receipts from customs were less than had been expected, and on the other hand the expenditures had grown to a sum much larger than in June had been imagined possible. The estimates of the summer session were based upon an army of 300,000 men. Double that number were now under arms. The pay and the rations of soldiers and sailors had also been augmented, and the Secretary found himself under the necessity of asking increased appropriations to the amount of $200 million. To meet this needed sum, he proposed to increase the tariff and the direct tax, to impose duties on liquors and tobacco, on notes and deeds, and to modify the income tax to the advantage of the Government. In the presence of the vast obligations devolving upon the administration, he did not hesitate to face the facts, and with a courage unusual in history and a sagacity as surprising as his courage, he announced to Congress that the public debt, which on the 1st of July, 1860, was but $64 million, and on the 1st of July, 1861, was $90 million, would probably amount on the 1st of July, 1862, to $517 million. It was apparent that the volume of currency in the country was not sufficient for the enormous requirements of the public expenditure. The banks could neither pay coin to the Government for bonds, nor dispose of them to their customers for specie. The weaker institutions were already tottering, and the stronger ones feared a crisis which would result in universal disaster. They met in convention on the 27th of December and agreed upon a suspension of specie payments, which took place the following day. The government necessarily followed the example of the banks, and the new year began with the melancholy spectacle of all the public and private institutions of the country redeeming their broken promises with new ones. The public debt had risen to $300,000,000. The Treasury was almost empty. The daily expenditures amounted to nearly $2,000,000. It was estimated that $350,000,000 were needed to pay the expenses of the government to the close of the fiscal year, and the Treasury had means for meeting the drafts of the government for less than 2 months. In the world of finance, as well as in the world of politics, it was generally agreed that the only resort of the government was paper money. Leading bankers throughout the United States urged this upon the Secretary of the Treasury as the only practicable expedient. The leading statesmen in both Houses of Congress were brought with extreme reluctance to the same conclusion. To no one was this decision more painful than to Mr. Chase. He agreed with the greatest of his predecessors in that famous report, which has become a classic in our politics and our finances, that the emitting of paper money by the authority of government is wisely prohibited to the individual States by the national Constitution, and the spirit of that prohibition ought not to be disregarded by the Government of the United States. The wisdom of the Government will be shown in never trusting itself with the use of so seducing and dangerous an expedient. The stamping of paper is an operation so much easier than the laying of taxes, that a government in the practice of paper emissions would rarely fail in any such emergency to indulge itself too far in the employment of that resource to avoid as much as possible one less auspicious to present popularity. If it should not even be carried so far as to be rendered an absolute bubble, it would at least be likely to be extended to a degree which would occasion an inflated and artificial state of things, incompatible with the regular and prosperous course of the political economy. But in spite of all this reluctance, Mr. Chase felt that an emergency was upon the Government from which this was the only issue. He saw that the corporate institutions of the country would not receive the notes of the Government unless they were made a legal tender by act of Congress. This state of things, he wrote, was the high road to ruin, and I did not hesitate as to the remedy. He threw the entire weight of his influence upon his friends in Congress and urged them to prompt and thorough action. In a letter to Mr. Stevens, the Committee of Ways and Means, he said: The provision making the United States notes a legal tender has doubtless been well considered by the committee, and their conclusion needs no support from any observation of mine. I think it my duty to say, however, that in respect to this provision my reflections have conducted me to the same conclusion they have reached. It is not unknown to them that I have felt, nor do I wish to conceal that I now feel, a great aversion to making anything but coin a legal tender in payment of debts. It has been my anxious wish to avoid the necessity of such legislation. It is at present impossible, however, in consequence of the large expenditures entailed by the war and the suspension of the banks, to procure sufficient coin for current disbursements. It has therefore become indispensably necessary that we should resort to the issue of United States notes. The making them a legal tender might still be avoided if the willingness manifested by the people generally, by railroad companies, and by many of the banking institutions to receive and pay them as money in all transactions were absolutely or practically universal. But unfortunately there are some persons and some institutions which refuse to receive and pay them, and whose action tends not merely to the unnecessary depreciation of the notes, but to establish discriminations in business against those who in this matter give a cordial support to the Government, and in favor of those who do not. Such discriminations should, if possible, be prevented, and the provision making the notes a legal tender, in a great measure at least, prevents it, by putting all citizens in this respect upon the same level, both of rights and duties. And several days later, on hearing some intimation that the committee thought he was not specially earnest in desiring the passage of the bill, he wrote to Mr. Spaulding: "It is true that I came with reluctance to the conclusion that the legal tender clause is a necessity, but I came to it decidedly, and I support it earnestly. Immediate action is of great importance. The Treasury is nearly empty. I have been obliged to draw for the last installment of the November loan. As soon as it is paid, I fear the banks generally will refuse to receive United States notes. You will see the necessity of urging the bill through without more delay." In both Houses of Congress the measure received the most violent denunciation on the part of those opposed to it, and even those who voted in favor of it explained their votes in speeches filled with deprecation of the necessity which demanded it. Mr. Sumner, after reciting in an eloquent and impassioned speech the evil which he thought would result from such a measure, concluded by saying: "If I mention these things, it is because of the unfeigned solicitude I feel with regard to this measure, and not with the view of arguing against the exercise of a constitutional power, when, in the opinion of the Government in which I place trust, the necessity for its exercise has arrived. Surely we must all be against paper money. We must all insist upon maintaining the integrity of the Government, and we must all set our faces against any proposition like the present, except as a temporary expedient, rendered imperative by the exigency of the hour. Others may doubt if the exigency is sufficiently imperative, but the Secretary of the Treasury, whose duty it is to understand the occasion, does not doubt. In his opinion, the war requires this sacrifice. Whatever may be the national resources, they are not now within reach, except by summary process. Reluctantly, painfully, I consent that the process should issue, and yet I cannot give such a vote without warning the Government against the dangers from such an experiment. The medicine of the Constitution must not become its daily bread." Mr. Fessenden, chairman of the Finance Committee, opened the debate in the Senate. He said: "The ground upon which this clause making these notes a legal tender is put, I have already stated. It is put upon the ground of absolute overwhelming necessity. That the Government has now arrived at that point where it must have funds, and those funds are not to be obtained from ordinary sources or from any of the expedients to which we have heretofore had recourse, and therefore this new anomalous and remarkable provision must be resorted to, in order to enable the Government to pay off the debt that it now owes, and afford circulation which will be available for other purposes. The question then is, does the necessity exist?" He did not hesitate to say that he would advocate the use of the strong arm of the Government to any extent in order to accomplish the purpose in which we are engaged. He would take the money of any citizen against his will to sustain the Government if nothing else was left, and bid him wait until the Government could pay him. It is a contribution which every man is bound to make under the circumstances. We can take all the property of any citizen. That is what is called a forced contribution. The question, after all, returns, is this measure absolutely indispensable to procure means? If so, as I said before, necessity knows no law. Say what you will, nobody can deny that it is bad faith. If it be necessary for the salvation of the Government, all considerations of this kind must yield. But to make the best of it, it is bad faith and encourages bad morality, both in public and private. Going to the extent that it does, to say that notes thus issued shall be receivable in payment of all private obligations, however contracted, is in its very essence a wrong, for it compels one man to take from his neighbor, in payment of a debt, that which he would not otherwise receive, or be obliged to receive, and what is probably not full payment. Mr. Collamer argued strongly against the legal tender clause of the bill. He considered it neither necessary nor constitutional. He referred to the debates in the Convention that formed the Constitution, to show that coin was the only legal tender contemplated by the founders of the government. There was an express power to borrow money on the credit of the United States. When there is an express power, there can be no implied power to do the same thing. There were two modes of replenishing the Treasury, one by taxation, the other by borrowing. To borrow, there must be a lender and a borrower, and both should act voluntarily and not compel the lender to part with his money without an inducement. The operation of this bill was not so honorable or honest as a forced loan. Mr. Spaulding, Mr. Conkling, Mr. Morrill, and Mr. Pendleton of the House, Mr. Bayard, and others of the Senate spoke in the same strain of sorrowful apprehension, but the bill became a law on the 25th of February, 1862. This important law, which Mr. Chase, as Secretary of the Treasury, urged upon Congress, and which Mr. Chase, as Chief Justice of the United States, afterwards decided to be unconstitutional, authorized the issue of $150 million of United States notes, not bearing interest, payable at the Treasury of the United States in denominations of not less than $5. These notes were to be received in payment of all debts and demands of every kind due to the United States, except duties on imports, which were payable in coin, and they were to be paid by the United States in satisfaction of all claims against the Government, except for interest upon the public debt, which also was to be paid in coin, the receipts from customs being devoted to this purpose, and these notes were to be lawful money and legal tender in payment of all debts, public and private, within the United States, with the exceptions above mentioned, and they were to be received at par in exchange for government bonds. By a later act, the demand notes were also made a legal tender, and some of the banks had refused to receive them without such provision. It was thought in February that $150 million of this currency would be enough, but in June it was evident that this would not be the case. $150 million more were demanded by the Secretary, and at once authorized by Congress. $35 million of this last issue were to be in denominations of less than $5. Even this vast volume of currency did not supply the insatiable demands of the time, and the rapidly increasing popularity of the United States notes, or greenbacks as they were called, induced the Government to ask, and Congress to grant, a wide extension of the authority to issue them, so that before the war ended, $1,250 million of legal tender had been authorized by Congress. Of this, $450 million were in legal tender United States notes, $400 million in Treasury notes payable not more than 3 years from date and bearing interest not exceeding 6%, $400 million in Treasury notes redeemable after 3 years, bearing a currency interest not exceeding 7 3/10%. This full authority was not availed of by the Secretary of the Treasury. The legal tenders outstanding on the 30th of June, 1864, amounted to $600 million, and a year later, under the administration of Mr. Fessenden, they amounted to $669 million. The public debt at the close of the fiscal year 1864 was $1,740 million, and the next year $2,682 million, which was increased some $200 million by the necessary expenses that followed as a sequel of the war. This is not the place to reopen the controversy which outlasted the war, and for years afterwards was an element of disorganization in politics and of a bitter and somewhat demoralizing dispute in both houses of the Congress of the United States. It will probably be the verdict of posterity, as it was the opinion of the ablest statesmen of the time, that the Legal Tender Act was a necessary exercise of the powers of the Government in a time of supreme emergency, that the result of that act was all that its advocates hoped for in sustaining the Government in a period of vast and compulsory expenditure, and that the evils which grew out of it, great as they unquestionably were not so disastrous as the fears of intelligent economists at the time apprehended. Gold, having been driven from circulation by the legal tender notes, became at once the favorite commodity for speculation in Wall Street, and while the premium upon it rose to a certain extent in proportion to the increase of the volume of paper money, and was subject to violent fluctuations in consequence of military successes or disasters, there was no such method in the course of its quotations as to render them explicable by either of these influences. It had become, so to speak, a fancy stock, and there was no more reason for its wilder fluctuations than for those of other securities which rise and fall in obedience to the currents of Wall Street, and without reference to intrinsic values. Just before the passage of the legal tender bill, the premium upon gold was 4 3/8 per cent, and shortly after it became a law the premium fell to 1½ but it gradually rose until in the middle of July it was 17, in the middle of October 32½, and at the end of the year 34. On the 25th of February, 1863, after the legal tender law had been in operation for a year, the premium on gold had risen to 72½. The brilliant successes of the national cause at Gettysburg and Vicksburg reduced it to 23½. It rose again in October to 56 3/8, and rose no higher than that until the following spring, when on the 14th of April, 1864, it was quoted at 88, and on the 22nd of June, as the consequence of an ill-advised bill passed by Congress to prevent speculation in gold, the premium climbed at once to the frightful altitude of 130, following the day afterwards to 115. On the 1st of July it jumped to 185, on the 2nd it fell back to 130, and on the 6th the unfortunate law, born of a short-sighted patriotism, was repealed. The mischief, however, was not yet over, for 5 days later there was a rise to 185 above par, the highest figure attained during the war, followed by a sharp fall, which continued until gold was quoted on the 26th of September at 87, thus falling nearly 100 points in less than 3 months. There was no warrant in the financial or the military condition of the country for these wild fluctuations. They were the offspring of the desperate efforts of cupidity and enterprise which found their predestined prey in the fears and apprehensions of more timid speculators. The Secretary of the Treasury was authorized in March, 1864, to sell surplus gold for the purpose of checking this speculation, and in April, the premium having risen to 75, Mr. Chase went in person to New York to try the effect of the sale of cash gold upon the trade in phantom gold. The day he arrived, the speculators defied him by running the premium to 88. He sold about $11 million, reducing the premium to 65, with convulsive fluctuations, but when the pressure of the Treasury was removed, the price of gold mounted as before. The same experiment was frequently tried afterwards with more or less success. The troubles of the time, which had reduced the Treasury of the United States to a condition of impoverishment, had exercised, as was natural, exactly the contrary effect upon the banks of New York. The timidity of capital had accumulated a great surplus of money in these institutions, with a far smaller number of loans and discounts than usual. The deposits amounted at the end of 1861 to $146 million. At the suggestion of John J. Cisco, the assistant treasurer in New York, the Secretary of the Treasury adopted a system of temporary loans which was sanctioned by Congress in a clause of the legal tender law, and the authority thus given was increased by successive acts until the limit was fixed at $150 million. These loans were not only of great advantage to the government as well as to the lenders, but they also served as a useful balance to the money market. In times of severe pressure, the reimbursement of large sums was often the means of temporary relief. Another expedient authorized by Congress on the 1st of March, 1862, was the issuing of certificates of indebtedness to such creditors of the United States as chose to receive them in payment of audited accounts. They were payable 1 year from date, with interest at 6%. The power to issue them was unlimited, and their extensive issue led at last to their serious depreciation. Another important clause of the Legal Tender Act, in addition to those we have mentioned, was that which authorized the Secretary of the Treasury to issue coupon or registered bonds to an amount not exceeding $500 million, redeemable at the pleasure of the United States after 5 years, and payable 20 years from date, and bearing interest at the rate of 6% per annum, payable semi-annually. They were to be exempt from taxation by state authority, and the coin from duties on imports was to be set aside as a special fund for the payment of interest on the bonds and notes of the United States and for other specified purposes. These were the famous 520 bonds, which, issued at first at a slight discount below par in paper, justified the faith and the sagacity of their earliest purchasers by a steady rise during all the years of their existence, and were all paid in gold or converted into other securities long before the time fixed for their redemption. All these measures, the Secretary said in his annual report of December, 1862, worked well. If Congress had passed at the previous session the national banking law which he urged upon it, he thought that no financial necessity would at that time have demanded additional legislation. But the bill, which had been introduced for that purpose a year before, had found few supporters. Its only advocate of prominence in the House of Representatives was Samuel Hooper of Massachusetts, a gentleman whose sound judgment and large knowledge of financial subjects gave great and deserved weight to his opinions. He could do nothing more at the moment than to obtain leave to bring in a bill for that purpose. But in the course of the year that followed, the absolute necessity for some such measure became every day more apparent. The coin in the country, variously estimated at from $150 million to $210 million, was absolutely inadequate to the demands of the time. The system of state banks in existence at the beginning of the war was not only incommensurate to the needs of the country, but radically vicious in itself. There was no uniformity of credit, no guarantee whatever of authenticity in circulation. Out of 1,500 banks, there were said to be fewer than 300 whose notes were not counterfeited. There was but a comparatively small number whose notes were not subject to discount outside of the State in which they were issued, and a citizen traveling from the Mississippi to the Hudson found the contents of his wallet changing in value whenever he crossed a State line. Of course, with the immense demand for currency created by the war, all these evils were greatly increased and aggravated, and when Congress met again in December, 1862, the Secretary urged anew, with the added weight of authority which came from a more fully matured plan and an enlarged experience, the scheme which had been treated with neglect the year before for establishing a safe and uniform currency throughout the nation. The National Bank Act was prepared in accordance with the views of Mr. Chase by E. G. Spaulding of New York and Samuel Hooper of Massachusetts, who were members of the Committee of Ways and Means, and during the month of December, 1861, it was printed for the use of that committee. The bill encountered most earnest opposition in the committee, which was busily engaged on the loan and internal revenue bills and other important work, and it was finally laid aside. In his report for 1862, Mr. Chase, again, notwithstanding the suspension of specie payments, earnestly advocated the measure. He said that among the advantages which would arise from its passage would be that the United States bonds would be required for banking purposes, a steady market would be established, and their negotiation greatly facilitated. It is not easy to appreciate the full benefits of such conditions to a government obliged to borrow. It would reconcile as far as practicable the interests of existing institutions with those of the whole people, and would supply a firm anchorage to the Union of the States. The same bill which had been printed for the use of the Committee of Ways and Means was afterwards introduced by Mr. Sherman and referred to the Finance Committee of the Senate, from which it was reported by him on February 2, 1863, with amendments. 10 days later it passed that body by a vote of 23 to 21, and on the 20th of the same month it also passed the House of Representatives by a vote of 78 to 64. The bill is understood to have had the sanction of every member of the Administration, and President Lincoln earnestly advocated its passage in his annual message in 1862, and in 1863 he said, "The enactment by Congress of a national banking law has proved a valuable support of the public credit, and the general legislation in relation to loans has fully answered the expectations of its favorers. Some amendments may be required to perfect existing laws, but no change in their principles or general scope is believed to be needed." Again, in 1864, he thus referred to it: "The national banking system is proving to be acceptable to capitalists and to the people. Changes from State systems to the national system are rapidly taking place, and it is hoped that very soon there will be in the United States no banks of issue not authorized by Congress, and no bank note circulation not secured by the Government. That the Government and the people will derive great benefit from this change in the banking system of the country can hardly be questioned. The national system will create a reliable and permanent influence in support of the national credit, and protect the people against losses in the use of paper money. Whether or not any further legislation is advisable for the suppression of State bank issues, it will be for Congress to determine. It seems quite clear that the Treasury cannot be satisfactorily conducted unless the Government can exercise a restraining power over the bank note circulation of the country." The bill was warmly advocated by those who appreciated its advantages, and as earnestly opposed by those who thought they foresaw the growth of a powerful monetary system dangerous to the popular liberties. Its chief opponent in the Senate was Collamer, who ably represented the traditions of the past. It was most efficiently advocated by John Sherman of Ohio, to whom was reserved a part of great honor and usefulness in bringing to a close the financial history of the war. The principal features of this comprehensive scheme were to open to private capital the business of national banking so freely that there could be no reasonable accusation of privilege or monopoly; to give to the whole system of banks a homogeneous circulation of notes, having a common impression, authenticated by a common authority, made safe by an adequate provision of specie, and secured for redemption by the pledge of United States bonds deposited in Washington; and finally, by the act of March 3, 1865, to tax out of existence the circulation of the banks organized under State laws. The whole system being thus based upon government bonds, several hundreds of millions of United States notes were funded in bonds. It was the Secretary's belief, afterwards fully justified under the wise and masterly administration of Mr. Sherman, that this system of national banks would be of invaluable assistance in the resumption of specie payment by the Government. He said: "If temporarily these associations redeem their issues with United States notes, resumption of specie payment will not thereby be delayed or endangered, but hastened and secured; for just as soon as victory shall restore peace, the ample revenue already secured by wise legislation will enable the Government, through advantageous purchases of specie, to replace at once large amounts, and at no distant day the whole of this circulation by coin, without detriment to any interest, but on the contrary with great and manifest benefit to all interests." The bill was constantly amended and improved, and although it might be too much to say that it was ever rendered entirely perfect, it is perhaps not unquestioned that few more wise and beneficent measures have ever been devised by American statesmanship. No financial operations so prodigious as those which we have thus briefly sketched had ever before been known. The largest loans ever made by England were those which she negotiated in the terrible years of 1812 to 13, when she was fighting at the same time Napoleon and the United States. The British government borrowed in those years $534,000,000, only a little more than Mr. Chase borrowed in 9 months. The estimated wealth of the United Kingdom at that time and of the loyal States in 1860 was almost the same, in each case something over 10,000 millions of dollars. Nowhere, we believe, do the annals of the world record such an appreciation of the public credit as that which is seen from the time of Mr. Lincoln's accession to the Presidency until the period of the resumption of specie payment after the close of the war. It was hard for Mr. Buchanan's secretaries of the Treasury to borrow money to pay the ordinary expenses of the Government at 12 per cent. Mr. Chase, as soon as Congress had given him command of the machinery required in the legal tender currency, the popular loan, and the national banking law, found no great difficulty in supplying at 6 per cent. The ravenous wants of a most costly war, and under the operation of the laws provided for him and similar legislation called for by his successors, the government credit gradually rose until its 4 per cents sold at 130, and its 3 per cents commanded a premium. At the beginning, the Secretary was forced to rely more upon individual patriotism than upon public confidence, but long before the war ended he had hundreds of millions at his command. In all these important labors Mr. Chase had the constant support of the President. Mr. Lincoln exercised less control and a less constant supervision over the work of the Treasury than over some other departments, but he rated at their true value the industry and the ability of the Secretary, and the immense responsibility devolved upon his department, and contributed to its success in every way in his power. He sometimes made suggestions of financial measures, but did not insist on their being adopted; and when the Secretary needed his powerful assistance with Congress, he always gave it ungrudgingly. In regular and special messages he urged upon Congress the measures which the Secretary thought important, and in frequent and informal conferences at the Executive Mansion with the leading members of both Houses he exerted all his powers of influence and persuasion to assist the Secretary in obtaining what legislation was needed. The monetary disorganization which preceded and accompanied the wreck of the Confederacy was so complete and so universal that Southern writers have taken no pains to preserve any accurate account of their financial system, if system it may be called, where system there was none. Their debt ceased to exist, their money lost all value at the instant the struggle became hopeless, for by the very terms of their certificates of indebtedness they had no worth until after the ratification of a treaty of peace between the United States and the Confederate States. It is estimated that when the war ended the nominal debt of the Confederate States was about $3,500 million. But these portentous figures had no meaning. Some Confederate writers think the actual cost of the war on the Southern side was in the neighborhood of 1,000 millions, but this, from the nature of the case, can never be ascertained with exactness. Their financial management was inefficient and chaotic from the beginning. Early in the winter of the first year of the war, the banks suspended specie payments. From the insufficient data obtainable, it is estimated that there were about 50 millions of specie in the South at that time, divided between the banks and the hordes of individuals. This gradually disappeared. Some was employed in the foreign trade, some seized by the government. Very little came to the surface when the war had ended. The paper money had extirpated it. In fact, the successive issues of paper money were the only events worth mentioning in the financial history of the Confederacy. The efforts made in other directions to give some solidity to their finances were feeble and nugatory. They issued a loan of 15 millions, bearing 8 per cent interest. This interest was payable in specie, which was secured by the pledge of an export duty of 1/8 of 1% per pound on the cotton sent out of the country. This loan was placed at satisfactory rates. The interest was paid for a little while, as promised, in specie. But the poverty of the insurrectionary government finally forced even this sacred debt to go to default. The cotton loans negotiated in Europe had a certain success, but the money resulting from them was mostly spent beyond the Atlantic and afforded little relief to the straitened treasury at Richmond. Heavy loans were made with the banks in the Southern States. When they matured, they were paid in Treasury notes. The banks, under the stimulus of the war and of the demands of the Richmond government, rapidly multiplied their circulation. Specie payments being suspended, there was no check upon expansion. Unsafe as the currency of the banks was, it was still regarded as more secure than the flood of paper money sent out by the Confederate financiers at Richmond, and gradually disappeared from circulation, being hoarded by the provident as a nest egg for quieter times. But in the course of the war, the banks were ruined by the annihilation of the paper values which formed their principal assets, and their carefully hoarded bills, when brought to light, were almost as worthless as the vanished Confederate currency. There was, properly speaking, no financial management of the insurrection. Issues of bonds were authorized by the Congress and made by the successive secretaries of the Treasury, but they bore no proportion to the ever-increasing expenses of the war, and the deficit had to be met by printing more money, which at last grew less valuable than the paper on which it was printed. There was in the end no definite relation between the price of gold and the value of the Confederate currency. In the North there was great fluctuation of such relative values, but they were generally the same at a given moment throughout the country. In the days of the wildest gambling in Wall Street, the quotations made there governed the price of gold in Boston, Philadelphia, and Chicago. But in the South it could hardly be said that quotations existed. At Richmond, the seat of the Confederate government, the gold dollar was frequently worth 50 or more paper dollars, while in the interior the business of the country was being transacted on a basis of 5 for 1. And even in the final throes of the insurrection, the currency never became so worthless in the rural districts as it was in the very shadow of the capital of Virginia. As the Confederate securities were intrinsically valueless except in the event of final success, their holders were sure sooner or later to lose their principal. But the Confederate loan was handled with such singular incapacity that its promoters did not derive from it even such advantage as was practicable. It is true that James M. Mason, the Confederate commissioner in London, did succeed in September, 1862, in placing cotton bonds to the value of some £60,000 through the house of W.S. Lindsay, M.P., an ardent Southern sympathizer. This was speedily absorbed by the needs of the rebel navy, and Lindsay proposed a far more extensive scheme of finance based on the delivery at Southern ports of cotton belonging to the Confederate government at the price of 4d. a pound. This would have afforded a large profit to those who actually got their cotton and sold it in England. But before this plan was carried into effect, Baron Erlanger and Mr. Slidell had arranged a scheme for placing a Confederate loan in England, and the cotton scheme of Mason and Lindsay was withheld so as not to embarrass the more brilliant operation. The loan was put on the market on the 18th of March, 1863, with all the appearance of a dazzling success. 5 millions sterling were subscribed the first day, the applications coming from every part of Europe. And before the books closed, 16 millions had been nominally subscribed, and the certificates commanded a premium of 5%, which, however, immediately dropped to 1 or 2. Mr. Mason wrote to Richmond in a tone of exultation over the triumphant success of our infant credit. It shows, malgré all detraction and calumny, that cotton is king at last. The triumph was short-lived. A few days later the loan began to drop in the market, and the Erlangers came in a panic to Mr. Mason, telling him that unless the price was somehow kept up, the loan would be wrecked. He therefore authorized them to buy in behalf of the Confederate government £1 million worth of the securities, and as this did not prove effectual in sustaining prices, he afterwards increased his order £500,000 more. This desperate expedient checked the disaster for a little while. The Confederates hoped to sell out their holdings at a profit, but the rise never came. In his final report of the transaction, Mr. Mason shows £1,388,500 on the wrong side of his ledger, and only £26,000 on the right. After Gettysburg and Vicksburg, the loan dropped 30%, and the Confederate credit was evidently wounded to death. Mr. Slidell afterwards gently reproached his government for not having let him know beforehand that Vicksburg was to fall, as in that case they could have disposed of the balance of their loan. All this while Mr. Mason in his dispatches deplored the blindness of the Germans, who were eagerly investing their savings in United States bonds at less than 50 cents on the dollar. He even went to Frankfort to warn them against this mistaken policy, taking an interpreter with him, as he was not himself polyglot. He did not succeed in convincing them, and came back to France at least so much wiser for his journey that he declined a proposition of Baron Erlanger to destroy the credit of the United States abroad by issuing an official and authoritative statement that the Confederate States would not hold themselves liable for a dollar of the United States loan. End of Chapter 11.